I'd like to begin this speech by thanking Keir Martland, MISES UK officers, for the remarkable work they've done for the cause of spreading the ideals of property and freedom in the United Kingdom, and for allowing me to speak at this conference. I especially like Andy Duncan, the podcast that you give on YouTube. I remember the last conference in the previous January. It took place in a small room in the upstairs of a pub and only had 3 speakers. So it delights me to see so many more libertarians in attendance at this year's conference, albeit in a much more grander setting and with 3 times as many speeches. Although one criticism I could levy against Keir Martland is he didn't have 100 seats or 200 seats instead of only 50. I'm sure they would have sold out equally well as the 50 seats. Let me move on to my speech. The metapolitics of libertarianism. In this speech, my aim is to provide you with an overview and critical analysis of the far-right movements that have developed in North America and in Europe, those being the alternative right and European identitarianism, which I'll examine in relation to libertarianism. My speech should be seen as supplementary to Hans Hermann Hoppe's Libertarianism and the Alt-Right, which Hoppe did last summer at the Property and Freedom Society. I hope to fill in the gaps in terms of things that I believe Hoppe did not address. In this speech, Hoppe precisely defined what the alternative right is. What Hoppe did not consider are the anxieties relating to the state of affairs in the modern Western world and why those who compose the alt-right believe libertarianism does not aid in providing a solution to these anxieties. In doing so, I will seek to answer why some former libertarians have come to believe that identitarianism and white nationalism may be more fit to answer questions that, at least in their eyes, libertarianism simply cannot answer, thereby providing an explanation as to why there exists a so-called libertarian-to-alt-right pipeline, through which principled, good-faith libertarians abandon all or some of their beliefs and migrate to the camp of the alternative right, to become white nationalists. Lastly, in this piece, I will comment on Hoppe's speech, arguing that it had effectively moved the libertarian ideology into the metapolitical field of identity politics, and why this re-evaluation of the methodology of cultural dissemination of libertarianism was actually an excellent strategic move on part of Hoppe. Let us start all the way back in August 2016. Back then, I wrote a piece called The Rise of the Radical Right, the Alternative Right, Neo-Reaction and the Trump Campaign, for the now defunct Libertarian Alliance blog, which has been taken over by MISES UK. In that essay, I made an attempt to trace the philosophical and concrete genealogy of the movement, and I defined the alt-right as the following. The alt-right is a term popularized by the self-described identitarian Richard Spencer, founder of the Alternative Right blog, and president of the National Policy Institute. The first person to coin the term in relation to developments within American politics, however, was Paul Gottfried. The alt-right movement itself is an amalgamation of all alternative right-wing factions that fall far beyond the Overton window and are considered heterodoxy to the mainstream of political opinions. Such views can range from disillusioned libertarians who previously supported Ron Paul, but upon becoming so-called race realists have adopted a variety of extreme views, to traditionalists, to ethno-nationalists, to European nationalists, to fascists and neo-Nazi types, people who gleamingly partake in alt-right discourse as it fits their racial and fascist agenda. Whilst on the other hand you have simply provocative teenagers and young adults who want to troll liberals and leftists through gratuitous displays of right-wing rhetoric and therefore create controversy. This is the makeup of the alternative right in terms of political factions. However, in terms of political philosophy, the most fundamental principle, if it can be called as such, of the alt-right is inequality. Inequality of the sexes, of the races, of the ethnic groups, and, of course, of individuals to individuals. For this reason, the alt-right are political authoritarians, rejecting democracy as an egalitarian mode of governance which promotes values that they see as going contrary to European values. Likewise, their belief in inequality, likewise due to their belief in inequality, they promote ethnic nationalism over civic nationalism, believing that Europeans should have an explicit in-group preference for their own kin over those of other races and ethnicities within European states, and the United States, of course. And their views on economic policy range. Some are outright socialists. Some, like Guillaume Fayet, see economic liberalism. Guillaume Fayet, a thinker of the French New Right, they see liberalism as preferable to socialism only because, contrary to socialism, it does not induce what he described as economic paralysis, but which is otherwise positive if it has instrumental value in serving a higher political will through its bringing forth of the spirit of initiative, competition, and responsibility. This simplistic view of economic liberty exemplifies just how little consideration the political philosophy behind identitarianism gives to economic policy, aside from a broad categorization of it as a preferable economic doctrine to socialism. From that definition, we can tell that the alt-right is not a cohesive movement, nor are its particular factions complementary. With more of a unified idea of the anxieties and problems that they face as a group, rather than political and economic solutions to those very problems. If libertarians, followers of a sophisticated political philosophy that stresses the importance of the abstracted individual, are turning to the alt-right, an ideology which emphasizes the very opposite, the collective values that I noted earlier, then I argue that the fault does not entirely rest on their shoulders. It is because they perceive that the questions they pose are not answered, or indeed perhaps cannot be answered by libertarianism, or worse, still cannot be asked as such as when the so-called Hans Hermann Hoppe caucus of the Students for Liberty conference invited Richard Spencer and were subsequently forced to promptly leave the conference building by Jeffrey Tucker and other such liberal or libertarians, to use Hoppian lingo. As the alt-right movement grew, so did its allure. The alt-right, within just 3 years, has become a phenomenon. Conversely, libertarianism as a political movement is perceived as having hitherto failed to make a meaningful difference in politics, aside from perhaps a few laws which legalize cannabis in the United States. So, therefore, it is paramount to analyze the anxieties and frustrations that undermine our belief in libertarian ideals. The definition of the alt-right that I gave earlier was published on Libertarian Alliance blog 4 days after Hillary Clinton gave her memorable speech on the alt-right. Since August 2016, numerous events relating to this new emerging racist ideology, as it was called by Clinton, have occurred. Trump won the presidential election. Hailgate happened at Richard Spencer's National Policy Institute. This is when, at the very end of his speech, Spencer shouted the now infamous phrase, and I quote, "Hail Trump, hail our people, hail victory," and he appeared to raise his hand in salutation. This act led some of the members of the audience to mimic the gesture. That event went on to become a major news story in the press, for obvious reasons. In February 2017, parts of Berkeley University, California, and the surrounding businesses were damaged as a result of riots stemming from the planned appearance of Milo Yiannopoulos at the university. Soon after, in April, the so-called Battle of Berkeley took place, in which right-wing libertarian and alt-right groups clashed with anti-fascists, resulting in arrests and multiple hospitalizations. And finally, we have in August the Charlottesville rally, in which protester Heather Heyer was killed. We now reach the present day, a time in which Richard Spencer is a household name in the United States. What has libertarianism achieved politically in that scale of time? This is not to say that the events that occurred within the alt-right during this time are in any way positive, but they show enthusiasm, growth, and vitality as an increasingly populist movement. None of our intellectuals are known by the general public. Even Hayek, arguably the best known advocate of libertarianism, is now known only to the public from the derision and blame he gets in articles of The Guardian for inciting the era of so-called neoliberalism. Libertarian Party in the United States, on the other hand, elected Sadsack Johnson to be their candidate for the presidential election. An avowed unlibertarian, gun grabber, a cake baker, and probably the only candidate in the election who used his time on national American television to compliment an opposing candidate by describing Hillary Clinton as a wonderful public servant. European libertarians, just like their compatriots in the United States, remain on the margins of politics, with smaller or greater think tanks and a handful of parties, though exerting no tangible effect on the main current of politics. On the other hand, European identitarians, just like the American alt-right, are a movement which shows vitality. The Generation Identitaire movement is the rough equivalent of the North American alt-right. They are an activist group promoting European identitarian interests, which draws inspiration from the thinkers of the Nouvelle Droite, the French New Right, which includes such figures as Alain de Benoit and Guillaume Fay. I'm sorry if there's a Frenchman, I just lost your language. Just recently, they re-established their UK chapter and carried out what they called the Defend Europe campaign, and received large support for having done so. Moreover, aside from them, Europe has been swept by a wave of populist sentiment from Poland to Germany to Hungary, Austria and France. Right-wing and far-right parties experienced a massive rise in support in polls and street demonstrations. This again is evidence of the vitality of the broader sentiment which encompasses the identitarian movement. However, the relative vitality of identitarian movements when compared to that of libertarianism is not a sufficient explanation as to why libertarianism is being abandoned in droves. A better explanation for that can be found in one of the texts which Generation Identity prescribes to potential activists, citing it as recommended reading on their website. This book is The Strange Death of Europe, authored by the UK neoconservative figurehead Douglas Murray. I believe that Murray, in this text, encapsulates the frustrations of those who compose the identitarian movement as a whole. In the text, Murray claims to have diagnosed a socio-psychological affliction which befell Western European countries, and which perhaps also adequately summarizes what may lead some former libertarians towards embracing the alternative right and identitarianism. This ailment he termed as existential tiredness. According to Murray, Europeans have lost faith in their beliefs, traditions, and their ability to assert the legitimacy to exist as a distinct ethno-cultural identity. That due to the rapid technological development, economic progress, and the accelerating complexity of the information age, Europeans have become fatigued and nihilistic. The tragic sense of life has been lost and replaced by a hollow cosmopolitan consumerism. This can be seen, Murray argues, through the way cathedrals and churches are no longer places of worship and communal congregation, but, at best, tourist destinations. At worst, passé reminders of a past hegemony of supposedly ignorant and obsolete beliefs. In a sense, what he is trying to denote is that Europeans are living on the dwindling cultural capital accumulated throughout the previous centuries. Language itself has been subverted. Discourse on any meaningful topic is shrouded behind ambiguous terminology, especially in the academia, and a form of cynicism regarding ideas has also taken hold, with Douglas going so far as to say that if there is any certainty, it is a distrust of certainty. The previous certainties lay as woeful reminders of all the dreams, religions, political ideologies, and 1,000 other aspirations that Europeans have experimented with throughout the course of the centuries, though Douglas Murray notes that this is particularly true in regards to the 20th century, a tumultuous period of history. Murray, in that way, unknowingly defined the postmodern condition. The postmodern condition is, as the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard described in his 1979 work of the same name, the development of incredulity towards meta-narratives within modern Western societies. In essence, making it so that collectively, Western Europeans have lost certainty in overriding narratives such as Christianity, Marxism, the Enlightenment project, and etc. meaning essentially that in the end there is no emancipation, no salvation, no teleological end of history. All we have to work with are our own personal subjective narratives, effectively depriving Western Europeans of a higher meaning. Whether this is a result of a conscious effort on part of some intellectual elite, or it is simply the inevitable result of the dynamics of history, philosophy, technology, and economics, I will not judge here. What remains pertinent is that this is the case in the minds of many. Those who have come to the alt-right, those who have come to be alt-right, came about as a rejection of spiritual nihilism. Likewise, I don't doubt that libertarians who have migrated to their camp have been influenced, to one degree or another, by the same sentiment. The canvas is painted even dimmer and the problem exacerbated through the understanding that the migrant newcomers into Europe have inherited none of these doubts, creating an unstable dynamic wherein the indigenous population is culturally and demographically perishing, whereas the migrant populations are thriving in both of these areas. Murray cites numerous surveys of social attitudes of migrant communities which run counter to the prevailing belief among social liberals that simple integration will occur and that these newcomers will adopt to European mores. Perhaps the most lucid example of the failure of integration of migrant communities in Britain is that of female genital mutilation. Female genital mutilation exclusively occurs amongst migrant communities in Britain, and there have been more than 130,000 recorded cases, none of which have yet to be successfully prosecuted, despite this act being illegal for 3 decades. This is a single example, but the magnitude of the problem only goes to show the lack of interest in full integration, and therefore the anxiety that libertarians turned identitarians may have of this group of newcomers. Hopper, in his speech, cited a figure in the alt-right movement called Colin Robertson. I reached out to Colin to inquire why he thinks this pipeline exists. Colin, who is better known by his YouTube moniker as Millennial Woes, was never, to my knowledge, a libertarian in any sense. But I believe that Woes would have some insight into the general sentiment of the movement and why it may attract libertarians. According to him, libertarianism is simply an assumption that libertarianism is simply an assumption that liberty is the most important thing to fight for. And the problem with having the assumption of liberty as the highest political good is that liberty is counterproductive towards the survival of Europeans, as it promotes and I quote, atomized attitude, or even a selfish attitude, which works towards actively harming the collective group interests of Europeans by giving license to so-called traitors and subverters. Furthermore, according to Woes, libertarianism does not answer the question of why be free. We should have liberty to do what exactly? Robertson believes that ultimately libertarians turn to the alt-right because they realize that their fetishism of liberty may have actually been a proxy or decoy, and a way to voice their disenchantment of the current state of affairs without actually accounting for the fundamental reason as to why this disenchantment existed in the first place. Woes agree that it is a kind of nihilism of the West that is the real reason behind the disenchantment of libertarians. Of course, Woes is incorrect in his understanding of libertarianism as a kind of mere fetishism of liberty, but it is understandable as to why he thinks libertarianism promotes the atomized abstract individual, given that this is the kind of individual that most mainstream libertarianism advocates in earnest, completely disregarding wider cultural and historical contexts. Having thus highlighted the anxieties of the identitarians surrounding mass migration into Europe and the devirilization of European culture through existential tiredness, it has become clear as to why libertarians become disillusioned with their philosophy and turn towards the alt-right and the ideology of identitarianism for a solution. Libertarians, those who join the ranks of the alt-right, do so through a loss of a transcendent meaning, and anger at the loss of cultural vitality. In doing so, they reject libertarianism through the understanding that it is a philosophy which does not provide answers to such metapolitical problems, and indeed may even harm their own collective group interests. Here I can move to the topic from which this speech derives its name. Metapolitical thinking and activism is an attempt by the European identitarians Firstly, as a tool to analyze and describe the present condition of Europe and North America. Secondly, to provide answers and responses to the crisis that seemingly haunts the Western world. And thirdly, to analyze how the structures of power which act in the maintenance of the present condition and the elite which benefits from it maintain themselves. Guillaume Fayet, a thinker of the French New Right, discerns metapolitics from politics, stating that metapolitics is the occupation of culture. Politics is the occupation of a territory. It is therefore everything that interacts or has a dynamic with politics, but it is not directly political. For a formal definition of the term, Fayet frames it as a kind of social diffusion of ideas and cultural values in order to provoke a profound long-term political transformation. This is actually quite equivalent to the Marxist Marxist terminology, the praxis, the philosophy of action. But until Hopper, libertarianism has had no good answer to these metapolitical questions of identity, of immigration, of multiculturalism and of globalization, which concerns identitarians. Hopper unwittingly advocated a metapolitical strategy of disseminating libertarians' ideals in his 2017 speech, when he proposed that any realistic strategy for change must necessarily be a populist one, in contrast to the Hayekian strategy, which depends on the spread of cultural information from the intellectual class through to the journalists and then onto the rest of society. Having done so, having moved libertarianism away from a philosophy focusing on the abstract individual into one that concerns itself with the collective identities which are shared by those individuals, Hopper moved libertarianism into the sphere of identity politics, which is one that is necessarily metapolitical. But Hopper's hand was forced in a way, since our opponents, the left, moved prior in the same direction, and we must follow if libertarianism is to remain relevant, not just to the wider political landscape, but especially to those who have just left it. So long as the left was focused on the economic analysis of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, libertarianism could advocate the rights of the abstract individual set apart from group interests. However, now that the left have become advocates of the historically marginalized or oppressed groups, not in economic terms, but in cultural and ethnic terms, through which they exert and derive their power, libertarians must do the same. Libertarians must likewise embrace those groups which would benefit from a libertarian social order, and which have historically been the most interested groups in libertarianism, so that they may derive from it a power base. In summation, now that Hopper shifted libertarian strategy into a metapolitical doctrine of identity politics, a doctrine which takes into account the perceived frustrations and anxieties faced by Western societies, with his advocacy of a revised Rothbardian 10-point program for right-wing libertarian populism, it is my sincere hope that those who have become disillusioned with libertarianism and turn towards the political extremes in order to find answers, that they may now come to once again embrace libertarianism.